So tonight, Tracy's going to talk to us about innocence and love and things like that through literature. So Tracy, it's great to welcome you back to York, and we're all looking forward to this very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. So will that come up?
Yeah, that
for
should
us?
start up a minute.
Just look at the pictures. Okay, so yes, thanks, John, for inviting me back to York. It's always a pleasure to visit. And my topic this evening is, I've called it Quotidian Utopia. And I've been looking for a little while at the novel by Orhan Pamuk called The Museum of Innocence. Has anybody read it? Nobody? Great. Okay, you can't contradict me then. Fantastic. And the museum which Orhan Pamuk built of the same name in Istanbul. And I have been thinking about what we can learn from this exercise in literature and museology about materiality and memory. And so I suppose my key concerns in my paper tonight are Pamuk's concern with experience and emotion rather than representation in his work, and with the vibrant materiality of objects rather than with representative collections as we generally know them in museums, and how this links to the scholarly shift in interest from what heritage might mean to what it might do. So I am very focused on materiality in this. And I want to draw a connection between this new preoccupation with the material in art and literature with what we might broadly term non-representational theory, or what's broadly, Latourian theory, and make a link between the preoccupations of the new materialisms and emerging new approaches to heritage archaeology and collecting practices which move away from human-centred world ordering to explore the embodied, multi-temporal, effective experience of material and social worlds. And finally, I'll come to the concept of utopia and how the field of heritage can be interpreted as a diverse set of practices which are at their core future-building activities and thus, inherently concerned with ethics and politics, and which I would argue can in fact be considered a distinctive form of utopian thinking in themselves. But I want to start tonight with, there's the Museum of Innocence as it was constructed. I'll tell you a bit more about the story in a moment. So I want to start tonight with a series of still life photographs that were made in 2014, and they're the work of a wonderful New Zealand artist called Fiona Partington. And I first came across them in the Auckland Art Gallery last year when I was writing a piece and thinking about writing a piece on memory and materiality in heritage studies. And it was one of those felicitous moments of discovery when I was wondering about a gallery for the first time during a few stolen moments in a work-related trip to Auckland. I hadn't seen Fiona Partington's work before, but her incredibly beautiful photographs immediately brought together and spoke to so many of the questions that I was reflecting on. The cultural, in this series, the cultural trope of the still life, used as a frame and as an aesthetic device, the cultural tradition of the genre evoked by the deep, dark old master's palette, the Rembrandt or Caravaggio-like gleaming darkness and glinting glass, nature more, objet trouvé, all these resonances contributing to the overall sensuous, sexy grouping of everyday or quotidian objects infused with memory. Objects that here are not in the least sense ethnographic, I would suggest, but objects that have complex specific biographies, local and global cultural associations, and each bearing traces of human use, collecting, hoarding and abandonment, but also the effects of the non-human environment. Glass tumbled in the ocean to round the sharp fractures into tactile talismans that I could almost feel in the palm of my hand. So back to my thinking and writing on memory and materiality that I was dealing with as I was going through this exhibition, and also to the ideas that I was developing about the Museum of Innocence, the novel and the museum, where memory and materiality are also key themes for any reading of this work. So one explanation for the recent exponential growth in the field of memory studies, or what Andreas Heissen calls the memory boom, and its rapidly burgeoning intersections with history, heritage studies and other disciplines, maybe because of the way memory is experienced through objects, places and landscapes. All are necessarily experienced sensuously through the body. And historian Kevin Berth has claimed that memory is now perhaps, as a field of study, much more alluring to historians because of the way it accommodates that immediate sensual local sense, as he termed it. This sense that's found in much older approaches to memory, such as Maurice Holbrook's and Henry Bergson, or Henri Bergson. So in fact, I've always loved the succinct statement that opens Henri Bergson's book from 1912 called Matter and Memory, and I'll quote it to you. This book affirms the reality of the spirit and the reality of matter, and tries to determine the relation of one to the other by the study of a definite example, that of memory. So in a way, that sentence to me has always seemed to distill centuries of push and pull between the Romantic and the Enlightenment or rationalist traditions in one sentence. So in today's language, we might substitute what Bergson called spirit with what scholars are now calling affect, and with the recent scholarly interest in the history, politics and cultural role of emotions. Now, sometimes this is termed the affective turn, and such research defines emotions, or sometimes called felt judgments, as embodied feelings experienced in the context of cultural values and discourses. And so it's this link with values that I think brings us to the field of heritage study. So this field's built upon the notion that emotions, including their bodily dimensions, are culturally and historically determined rather than biologically based and common to all humans. Although they obviously have a neurological basis, they are learned and expressed in different ways according to social context. So these scholars stress that emotions may be collective, they're historically created and locally contingent, and that they can flow in systems of circulation and exchange that Sarah Ahmed terms emotional economies. And so the study of affect and emotion has also turned heritage scholars inwards towards understanding our own positioned subjectivity, including approaches such as autoethnography or practice-led research that encourage us to scrutinise our own methodological and theoretical presuppositions and focus on our own engagement with the stuff that we study, essentially why we love it, and how this contributes to our understanding of materiality. But as recently as 2004, Nigel Thrift, who's a key writer on the spatial politics of affect, was able to write that the affective or emotional dimensions of space and place, and the historic environment, if you like, had been largely neglected in geography and urban studies of various disciplinary ilks, including, of course, heritage studies at that time. So Thrift claimed that to read about affect in cities and landscapes, and to quote him, it's necessary to resort to the pages of novels and the track lines of poems, where, of course, we're more overwhelmed with examples, or more than overwhelmed with examples. However, as I've just outlined, in the intervening years since 2004, affect and emotion have indeed become central, although I would still say emerging themes in heritage studies. but perhaps less well developed in heritage management and museum contexts, where I think we can sometimes see a kind of add emotion and stir approach, an instrumental use of emotion and empathy stirred into various forms of emotionally manipulative, didactic experiences and engagements. So what's brought me to this creative work of literature, the Museum of Innocence, is its focus on materiality and the world of objects. And indeed, more broadly, a renewed concern with materiality can be traced in a lot of recent literature and art, as we've already seen in the example of Fiona Partington's photography. And I'll return to that point a little bit later on. Oh, these were just some images from my work that I was doing at the time on materiality and memory and identity, and a practice-led project on artifacts working with an artist called Ursula Frederick. So let's come to the Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk. So the novel tells a love story, and it's set against the background of social upheaval in Turkey and the manifestation of this change in Pamuk's beloved urban landscape of Istanbul. And for those of you who don't know his work, he writes regularly about Istanbul in a very effective manner. And while I'm not a literary scholar and I'm not centrally concerned with the literary qualities of this work, I use it here as a kind of what I would call a speculative ethnography. I'm arguing for its validity as a source to learn something about the relationship between the individual, collective memory and the nation state, and about place attachment, and about what Dennis Byrne has called object-mediated empathy. So the Museum of Innocence was published in Turkish in 2008, and an English translation by Maureen Freely appeared the following year. The novel catalogues, and I use the term catalogue because Pamuk originally thought of writing the novel in the form of a museum catalogue. He eventually abandoned that attempt, but it still retains some of that structure. It's very episodic. So it catalogues a convoluted tale of lost love, exploring themes of desire, unstable identities, modernity, memory, affective objects, and obsessive collecting. The love story at the centre is between characters Kemal and Füsun, and it's set in the 1970s and 80s. And the novel spirals in time around these characters, their families and the events and the aftermath of their disastrous affair. The novel evokes memories of Istanbul from the 1950s to the 2000s in its detailed descriptions of social life and material culture. And the novel is structured around domestic and foreign objects, using the commodities of Western capitalist modernity to highlight social change and tensions in Turkish society. The protagonist of the story is Kemal. He's not a very attractive character, really. He's a cosmopolitan, upper-class Istanbulite who, at the age of 30, is engaged to the his very suitable fiancée, Sybil, but who nevertheless seduces 18-year-old Füsun, a beautiful lower-middle-class shop girl, as she's called in the novel, who he meets through the purchase of a fake designer handbag. Very symbolic object there that they come together over. The novel traces the failure of their brief relationship and Kemal's subsequent obsession with collecting objects associated with his young lover. And her later suicide then sets Kemal on a quest to create a museum to house the assembled material culture of their love. And he enlists the help of the character of Orhan Pamuk, the author, who appears as a character in the novel, in this task. So a key conceit in the novel is Füsun's resistance against her objectification by Kemal and by society more broadly, and against the restrictions of gender roles and social expectations. for unmarried women in Turkey at that time. Both Sybil and Füsun give their virginity or their innocence to Kemal, who betrays them both, jeopardising their social futures. Füsun's sexual adventurousness, however, also means that Kemal is unable to own her, which we learn is the translation of that term own is the term used for having sex in colloquial Turkish. Kemal is self-absorbed and blind to Füsun's desires while she lives and her aspirations for her life. But after her death, although condemned to care for his collection of objects in a way that he failed to do for the unobjectifiable woman, he eventually shifts his understanding of the world through the course of this very long novel, and eventually finds a form of happiness. Just to quote, at the pristine and perfectly maintained, I'm quoting a thought of Kemal. So at the pristine and perfectly maintained Rocox house in Antwerp, I had occasion to remember that in small museum houses, the past is preserved within objects as souls are kept in earthen bodies. And in that awareness, I found a consoling beauty that bound me to life. So Pamuk also published a museum catalogue. It's called The Innocence of Objects. And in it, he recounts how the process of writing the novel was intertwined with years of his shopping and collecting in Istanbul flea markets and junk shops. He used the found objects to inspire and constitute the material world of the novel, and they're the basis now for this collection, which is installed in the actual museum that he built with funds that he won from winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. To quote Pamuk, the more objects I collected for the museum, the more the story in my mind progressed. I began to collect these things from the mid-1990s onward to create the universe of objects that fills the museum and the novel. And Pamuk often expressed his happiness and optimism as he pursued his project. Well, he just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, so he obviously was quite chuffed about that. To quote him, I continued to buy objects with joy, keeping them in my house without telling anyone why. And while the novel chronicles a tragedy, it begins and ends with reflections upon happiness and love. And to quote Pamuk again from an interview, so in my novel where Kemal collects the teacup, the cigarette butts, the bedroom door handle and other items of Füsun, he's building a museum not to power, but to the intimate experience of love, to an individual life. So Pamuk records that before the 1990s, the shops of Çukurçuma, I find this hard to pronounce, Çukurçuma flea markets were still full to the brim with things left behind by the non-Muslims, especially Greeks, who'd been forced out of Istanbul from the 1950s onwards. So he's very aware of the political overtones of the material culture that he's collecting. He claims that the rising middle class of Istanbul at this time had little interest in heritage museums or, in fact, the recent past, and were just as ambivalent about relics from the earlier Ottoman period in their concern to accumulate the material culture of Western modernity. And Pamuk aligns a sense of historical collecting with the Western outlook of what he calls a few pitied hoarders who believed that, to quote again, one day Turkey too would be wealthy and museums, libraries and archives would be set up just like in the West. However, despite this veneer of concern for the past by these collectors that Pamuk is interested in, Pamuk insists that this collecting was in fact focused on creating new identities for a new future. To quote him again, despite all their idealistic talk about history and memory, the first collectors did not set out to preserve the traces of a past life, but to fashion for themselves a new identity and a new future to go with it. To Pamuk, these displaced, innocent objects recall the impact of Turkey's turbulent history and social conditions on individuals, suggesting also that some people consciously worked against this attachment to the material past because it could be so easily lost. And as one Istanbul photographer and collector said to Pamuk, "You fool," he said, "one day there will be another military coup and they'll draw up a piece of paper and they'll confiscate it all," referring to his Pamuk's collection. The charitable foundations and your museum included. Pamuk published in his catalogue a manifesto called the Modest Manifesto for Museums, and it's received quite a lot of attention in museological circles up to date. And it mounts an argument against the need for any more big state-sponsored museums, the aim of which is to represent the state and extend its power. He expresses dismay at the massive Louvre-like institutions created in cities, currently being created in cities like Beijing and Abu Dhabi, where he argues they overwhelm the neighbourhoods that they're imposed upon and do nothing to support local artists and act as smokescreens for the crimes of authoritarian regimes. That's a quote from an interview with Pamuk. So it's in this political context that I see the traces of utopian thinking in Pamuk's work. He argues for a form of heritage, a new form of heritage that is reclaimed from the state's control by creating a new kind of aesthetic, a new kind of beauty around the quotidian fabric of ordinary human lives. Thus his fictional but also real museum, because it's both at the same time, is his utopia. The museum and its catalogue much more clearly resemble, and these images are all from the displays in the museum, they much more clearly resemble a social history of 1950s to 70s Istanbul than does the novel, which is more focused on the characters' interior thoughts. The collections of ephemera and bric-a-brac are entwined in the narrative spiral of the museum building. Collections. I'm just going to rush. Yeah. So this is how you enter the building. He's constructed the story on this narrative spiral and actually materialised it here in the fabric of the architecture. And of course, the building itself, which I showed a slide of earlier, is actually another artefact that's been rescued by Pamuk from what was a decaying Çukurçama neighbourhood, which has now also been revalued due to the very successful business venture that the museum has become. And to top off this delicious conflation of heritage, fiction, politics, economics, poetry and art, the museum won European Museum of the Year in 2014 for its excellence in providing, and I quote, a model for a small, local, sustainable museum. So one of the concepts that I wanted to mention in relation to this museum and the way in which the novel treats material culture is the concept of heritage significance or heritage value. So this concept, as I'm sure you're all working with, is both a theory of cultural value in heritage, and it's also a methodology or a method in heritage management practice. So during the course of the 20th century, the practice of heritage conservation can be seen as shifting from ostensibly shared historical and aesthetic values and stewardship ethics towards building more publicly transparent and legally defensible methods for objective assessments of value, through to the more recent development of ethics and critiques that aim to make vested interests in heritage visible and allow for the recognition of cultural relativities. So while heritage studies has a very rich critical tradition around questions of whose heritage or whose values, understanding how cultural values are constructed and experienced has been in some ways constrained by the way in which they're measured against and made legible through the very dominant frame of the nation state as the preeminent context and narrative structure for the imagination of the past and its importance in the present. So thus, significance methods deployed within these hierarchical structures become the state's pseudo-empirical, self-referencing and self-constituting definitions of its own importance. And this is to say the system works to create the reality that it appears to describe. And as Dennis Byrne has argued, complex forms of local place attachment are flattened into the state's tractable spatial management mechanisms, such as inventories, which effectively abstract values legible to the state from a far more complicated array of affective intensities. So what's not changed over the last century is that the ethical outcome of the attribution of significance or value has assumed to be conservation or retention or collection. And it's only in recent analysis that the implication of the uncritical acceptance of this position has been challenged, and arguments have been mounted for the value of decay and for more sustainable collecting practices. And I believe your next seminar will be about one of those particular arguments. So Orhan Pamuk's Museum of Innocence speaks perhaps ironically to both sides of these debates. It accumulates obsessively, but uses a reverse heritage methodology of insignificance to appear to subvert the grand narratives of Turkish nationalism and give back the emotional power of quotidian or everyday objects that the usual process of heritage value assessment would tend to edit out. And it aims not to represent, but to constitute empathic, materially mediated experiences of the everyday, particularly of joy, love, and happiness, emotions that are rarely encompassed or made visible through the frame of heritage. So perhaps partly in response to the way in which significance assessment can strip away the emotional content of people's relationships with their material world, much contemporary heritage studies research is seeking ways of thinking about heritage that reimagines the body, memory, and intersubjectivity. So in attempting to go beyond the dualisms of material and meaning, nature and culture, mind and body, scholars have turned their attention to, as I've already outlined, more than representational theories and to the materiality of social life. So this renewed concern with effect and materiality is not only a significant feature of recent humanities scholarship, but or heritage scholarship, I should say, but can also be traced in art and literature, as I've already discussed in relation to Fiona Partington's work. But as well as Orhan Pamuk's work, I could mention a couple of other literary examples. Some of you may have read the loving family chronicle of Edmund Duval's The Hare with the Amber Eyes. Or some of you may be familiar with the Marxist speculative realism of China Miéville's novels, such as The City and the City. And my particular favourite is his short story, The Reports on Recent Events in London. And although this literature shows very different approaches, all of it is freely delving into the effective economy and politics of objects, architecture and place, and explore the more than human materiality. And so some have interpreted this literary interest in materiality as a yearning for the authenticity of the real and as a reaction to the rise of the digital. However, I don't agree with this interpretation, and I prefer to see this turn, as some call it, as more an avant-garde form of realism in itself, which seeks to constitute an effective realm of experience rather than a representation of reality, and which characterises, or rather than representations rather, which characterise earlier forms of literary realisms, such as the 19th century realism of Balzac, Émile Zola, and Gustave Flaubert. So However, Pamuk's use of insignificant objects doesn't aim to create the illusion of reality, but to constitute, as I've said, an effective here and now. And one scholar, Jakubowski, has described this as the Latourian democratic creation of meaning and reality by human and non-human actors alike. The salt shakers, one of the key objects in the novel, might be man-made, but at the same time they possess a life of their own. So aligning this renewed interest in the material with the non-representational, this whole area of Latourian non-representational theory, allows us to make a link between the preoccupations of the new materialism and with our emerging approaches to heritage museums and collecting, which are moving away from human-centred world ordering to explore these more embodied, effective experience of material and social worlds. Just to quote from the novel, all these objects, the salt shakers, the china dogs, the thimbles, pencils, barrettes, ashtrays, had a way of migrating like flocks of storks that flew silently over Istanbul twice a year to every part of the world. What is certain, someone somewhere had produced the first of these salt shakers and then made the moulds for them for mass production in many other countries, so that over the years, millions of copies had spread out from the southern Mediterranean and the Balkans to enter the daily lives of untold families. And so while these displays that I've been showing you found inside the Museum of Innocence are case studies in the effective qualities of modern mass-produced industrial objects, this sensual surface, the beauty and the aesthetics of the displays smooths over but doesn't conceal a subcutaneous layer of politics. The key objects in the novel are all mass-produced items that possess an industrial anonymity, an ambiguous lack of cultural identity within their complex transnational networks. And while Pamuk's objects collectively do evoke a distinctively Istanbulite past, they do not claim an authentic Turkishness. But they do celebrate the comfort and consolation of quotidian activities and rituals, smoking, shared meals, a hairbrush. So Frederick Jamieson, a scholar of utopian literature, makes the point that the loss of bourgeois individuality is one of the great anti-utopian themes, particularly you might think of a lot of science fiction literature that deals with that theme of the loss of individuality in an untold future. However, it's in the experience of the everyday that the individual and the collective are signified. And according to Barth, a famous quote, the hallmark of utopia is in the everyday. So I just want to finish up with a few thoughts on the concept of that I've been calling in my work shattered heritage. So drawing from the writings of a philosopher called Jean-Luc Nancy in his piece called Shattered Love, in his work The Inoperative Community. So Nancy writes, and I quote him, "As soon as there is love, the slightest act of love, the slightest spark, there is the ontological fissure that cuts across and disconnects the elements of the subject proper, the fibres of the heart." So we commonly see heritage explained as a form of desire in heritage studies writing, desire for recognition, desire for reparation, desire for social justice, and perhaps most dominantly, the desire for visibility, one of Foucault's key conditions for the possibility of power. But what would a heritage not of desire and longing, but of love, look like, and what would it feel like? So Dennis Burns recently observed that while heritage studies focus so much attention on trauma, war and violence, to quote him, there's curiously little directed to what might be thought of as the other end of the spectrum of human experience: pleasure, happiness and love. So while, make no mistake, Pamuk's Museum of Innocence is centrally concerned with the politics of nationalism, with Orientalism, gender and class, the novel and the museum are also a form of political and artistic activism, which poetically conveys a sense of what we might call the irretrievability of the lives of others, by using object encounters to shatter heritage, fracturing the subject-object relations of individuals and the nation-state, and opening the reader or the viewer to an experience of shared quotidian pleasures and the broken-hearted pain of love. So in a small way, I think Pamuk's museum is his aesthetic guide to a utopia in which heritage museums and collections of old things are instrumental not in narrating the nation's exclusive identities and values, but in shattering these subjects with a form of community-based empathy or intersubjectivity, a heritage of love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Fascinating stuff. And even though I don't think anyone's read the novel, I think I read that correctly earlier on. I don't think that's disadvantaged us at all in reading that presentation. Thank you. So we have time for some questions or discussion. Does anyone want to start us off with a question? Yes.
Okay, I'll claim I don't have a heritage background at all. So I found the paper tonight really quite challenging, quite complex. A lot of the ideas, some which I'm familiar with, some I'm not. Some of the terminology that we not introduced but discussed, memory, materiality, heritage, museums, Museum of Innocence. I'm feeling conflict with those terms because from where I'm sitting, I see an art installation, and it impacts on me more as that, as opposed to the story which you've given about reflection of culture and growth and society, etc. Am I at fault for that reaction?
No, I think that's the reaction probably we're all having to the Museum of Innocence. That's the paradox. It's fiction, but it's real. He's called it a museum. It's won an award for being the best small museum in Europe. It's a real collection that's been put together, but the installations, each installation is a chapter from the book. So you're right, it is an art. We can call it an art installation as well. There's an interesting melding of fiction and reality in the book as well, and he does deal with that. So it's clearly a fictional, it's a novel, so it's fictional, but it's about Orhan Pamuk's life world, and so that's why I've chosen to treat it as some kind of an ethnographic exercise in my analysis. Pamuk always writes about his embeddedness in Istanbul and the conflicts that he's been involved with. He's had a number of run-ins with the Turkish state, so he is a public intellectual in that field. And it's a postmodern novel because the author inserts themselves at various stages and speaks as the author. So it's all of those things. So I think you're quite correct in picking up these contradictions. It's a paradoxical situation, and I've talked about this in a number of venues, and I'm always interested to hear how heritage people react to the made-up quality of the museum, and how they feel about the fact that people are paying their money to go and see a museum that is one man's vision. And is that any different? Is that any different from the Sir Walter Soames Museum or some of these other famous collections in Britain? I'll leave my answer there. Sorry, raving on a bit.
Yeah, no.
I was just wondering, Because obviously the Museum of Innocence is tied around the story within the novel, so in some ways there's that sort of emotional access point. So in museums which aren't based around a sort of a public story in the same sense, how do you think that effectiveness can be reproduced?
It's an interesting question. Well, I suppose one thing we could say is that all state museums are based on a story. And I suppose we might debate what that story is, and the museum itself may have internal debates about what that story, but there's, you know, various narratives are being interpreted maybe simultaneously. But I suppose the power of the nation state is that it always manages to assert itself as a coherent entity. And Pamuk has written about that in his manifesto, and he's in a very straightforward manner. He writes in very simple language, saying, if I can remember the quote, is saying, "We used to have princes and palaces, and we used to have epics, and now we have national museums, and they should be more like novels, but they're not." So very bad paraphrasing. But he's saying what is being lost in that context is any sense of the individual. And he doesn't sort of intellectualize much further than that. It's a plea for the poignancy of individual lives and to somehow respect that, to give it emotional power and to reflect that. So he's chosen, in my view, to do that through this device of actually materialising his novel.
Questions? I wanted to ask a bit about the museum. I don't know it. I've never been to it. You have, presumably, have you?
No, I haven't.
No. I mean, I'm interested in who. Do we know anything about the profile of the people visiting? Do we know what the reaction has been to the museum amongst visitors, international and domestic visitors, perhaps?
Only what I've been able to read in accounts. I'm going there on the 23rd of October.
I thought that might be the purpose of your trip
for my first visit. It's run very much. What I can perceive from a distance is that it's run very much like a business. I have talked to several people who visited. Pamuk has written and a lot about what he intended for the museum, and he's made a number of films about it as well. So there's a lot of material in the public domain from Pamuk, and there's a small number of reviews, and as we might expect, some people are totally captivated. So I talked last week in Stirling to one of the heritage lecturers there, Sally Foster, who has visited it, and she visited it without reading the novel and loved it for a range of reasons. But I've read a number of negative reviews where people find it thin and they don't find the design or the artistic excellence, I suppose, or the aesthetic success of the museum to match up to their expectations. One review I was reading said, "Well, Pamuk should stick to writing novels." But I think probably there's more reviews that suggest people do find it quite captivating. And the novel itself has a ticket to the museum. In the back of every hard copy novel that you buy, there's a ticket. So if you take your novel to the museum, they will let you in for free. So obviously if you don't have the novel, you have to pay a charge. I'm not sure what the charge is. And the novel's about this thick, so I wasn't able to bring it in my suitcase from Australia. I had to bring it on my Kindle. So I don't know if they're going to let me in for free with my Kindle version of it. So yes, I mean, like you, I'm intrigued about what will be the longevity. He has set up a foundation. He's put money into a foundation that's called the Innocence Foundation. He's supporting internships for museum studies students and public spirited things like that. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yes.
Probably the questions.
No.
It's just really if you could expand a little bit on your thoughts about memory and what memory actually is and what it means. I mean, as academics and researchers, we are presented with a whole host of theoretical debates about what memory is and who experiences it, and for how long they experience it, what it actually means. I have a view that there are different stratas of experience, and as I say, as academic researchers, we focus on quite a narrow strata, when the reality is that most people have an experience of memory. It might be grandfather's walking stick, etc., but it doesn't preoccupy their day. They've got to go to work, they've got to earn a living, etc. So do we sort of impose too much of a theoretical view of memory on people's everyday lives? And how do you relate that to the objects which are placed in, quotes, museums?
Well, I suppose in my paper I was referring to memory in the context of memory studies. So the argument that I was trying to make was to take the fact that memory studies as an area of scholarly endeavour has exploded in the last couple of decades, and it's grown exponentially. The number of journals has grown. I know when I first started working in heritage and conservation in the 1980s, I had never heard of memory studies. It obviously was a scholarly area, but I didn't deal with it in my day-to-day. And when I first maybe became aware of memory studies when I was doing my PhD in the 1990s, I was very confused, saying, what's the difference between memory studies and heritage studies? And, and it was a problematic area. So, I mean, I can't answer your question about what is the correct definition of memory and how it should be applied in an anthropological context of doing fieldwork. What I was trying to allude to was different ways of studying memory and how it's intersecting in these fields. There was, I think it's probably correct to say that traditional historians were very sceptical of memory studies and of the difference between memory and history. There are some definitions. I don't think I can pull any one out of my memory at the moment, my memory, which is failing at the moment. That memory is it's emotionally experienced. It's based on it draws on myth and fact and images. Where history, is an intellectual discourse and a field of study. But as the scholars that I was quoting in the paper are saying, it's in the last decade, I would say in particular, it's become much more fluid. There's much more intersectionality in disciplines. Disciplinary boundaries are breaking down. So, I think from a scholarly perspective, this is very interesting for us to try and sort out. I suppose for me, you can't do heritage studies without engaging with the memory studies literature. Memory studies relies on that experiential quality. Memory has to be experienced by somebody. There's various terms that are used to divide up memory studies. There's cultural memory, collective memory, social memory, public memory. There's probably more areas. Probably each of those areas have a couple of journals devoted to it. And one that I've been reading recently is rhetoric studies in memory, which is fascinating. So I think there's a difference between what we might say as ways of thinking and approaching how the past is experienced and manifested in the present, and how we might anthropologically or ethnographically attempt to understand how individuals or groups of people or communities work with memory or feel about memory in their daily lives.
Don.
I'm intrigued by the idea that Pamuk made a museum which self-consciously reflects the novel. And embodied the narrative of the novel in the physical museum. And yet, any museum curator knows that when visitors go to the museum, they derive their own narrative from what they see. Does Pamuk see any tension in that? Or is he quite happy for people to say, oh, the novel doesn't matter, I'm getting what I want out of this museum?
I don't know, of course, but from what he's written, I feel that he'd have to be aware. He knows that there are people going to the museum without having read the novel. I think in some ways, from what I've read, I think he does see it as his gift to Istanbul and to that particular little neighbourhood that was very run down and crumbling away, and which has been given a huge economic injection from the business. He's made travelling exhibitions. I think one came to London a few years ago, and he's made, as I said, a number of films. So I don't think. I suppose my take on it would be that he wouldn't care if people, how people reacted to it. I think in his view it's about place, it's about Istanbul, it's about memory and the past, and and it's his sense of that he's given some dignity to the lives, to ordinary lives, which, and you've got to remember, of course, Istanbul doesn't have like a Museum of London that sort of historicises the city, and in Sydney we have the Museum of Sydney that makes it its job to archive and reflect stories of, and Istanbul doesn't, it has a different museum and archiving and library tradition to what we might be. And I think Pamuk is very conscious of his position as an intellectual that sits betwixt the traditions of the East and the West. He has a classical education and he can speak English, and his novels are translated by a translator, but he obviously operates in both worlds. But the novel itself reflects this tension. The character of Kamal in the novel often asks himself questions about his identity as a Turk. In making his collection, Kamal sets out to visit all the house museums in the world that he can, and I think he visits 1,174 or something like that, and he writes them all down. And he writes about, what do the other people in these museums think about me? What do they see? Do they see somebody who's different? Do they see somebody the same? So Pamuk is dealing with these questions of national identity that we're so familiar with in a different way. So I don't really think I really answered your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I've missed this given the complexity of your arguments, but if an absolute layman, without reading the novel, walked into the museum, what would they get from the experience?
Well, I'll tell you in a couple of weeks. Well, I can't really, can I? Although I am taking my husband, so we could use him as a guinea pig. He hasn't read the novel. There is an audio guide, I believe, that tells you the story. So there's a strong narrative thread through the museum, and so that each of these latrines is numbered. So, you know, unless you were a really chaotic visitor who totally refused to do it in order, then I think you're invited to partake in a narrative of some kind.
But I mean, what I guess I'm asking is, to what extent would somebody not go in and see it as the materiality being reflective of a sort of more social history of Istanbul? Is that something that they get, or is that lost in the narrative?
Well, I think people are likely to see it as reflective of, you know, the social history of the recent past of Istanbul. I think, you know, the objects are real. They're material. They've been collected from flea markets, and they're things that have meaning to Pamuk from his social life. They're things that he recognised from his childhood and his background. So yes, I think it's all intertwined. I think he's inviting the viewer to understand that it's a fictional narrative, but it's about the world. In fact, there's a quote in the novel where Kemal says to the character of Orhan Pamuk that he says, I think, he actually addresses your question actually. He says, I think visitors to the museum will understand that this is not just a museum to a love story, but is a museum of the whole realm, that is, of Istanbul. So that's a paraphrase of a quote from the novel.
So in that sense, it's not an art installation at all, it's a museum.
No, I think it is an art installation.
It's a museum.
Anything that has to tell you what to think as you go in there is an art installation.
It's not most
well,
museums do.
I think yes. I just went to the National Museum of Scotland the other day.
Yes, there's a lot of art in there.
For the first time, it's fascinating. Yeah.
You used the term insignificance a couple of times. I know that this is something that you're thinking of, and I am too, with you actually. But has this caused you to caused any new reflections on that, on the use of that term? Does it mean something different to you now, having experienced all of this, perhaps, to what you were thinking previously?
Well, I suppose in thinking through that term of insignificance, which I think means something slightly different to Steve Brown, who's a collaborator that we're working with, than it does to me. I suppose I thought through my rationale of insignificance very much by using the Museum of Innocence example as my starting point. And so for me, you use the term cultural significance here. You know, assessments of cultural significance, you know, it's such an important methodology. From my work in recent weeks in Scotland, I would observe that it's probably a far more embedded and bureaucratised methodology in Australia than it is in Scotland, and maybe, I don't know about in England, but it's, you know, I've been working in heritage management since 1986, and you know, it was the first methodology that I learned, and there's masses of guideline documents. We have a foundational document called the Borough Charter in Australia, which encapsulates what is meant by the concept of cultural significance. But then we have, you know, every state has, you know, different guidelines and different definitions of terms. And in creating those frameworks and principles and guidelines and hierarchies of value, there always has to be a measuring point on the on the process. Something has to be significant compared to something else, and that aspect of the methodology has become more and more emphasised in Australian heritage management. We used to have a national system called the Register of the National Estate, which actually didn't have any hierarchies of value in it at all. It had a definition that it would list places, they actually called them places in the heart of communities, and it just took a nomination from a community to have something placed on the Register of the National Estate. That just had to have community support. And in 2004, I think it was, the Register of the National Estate was thrown out by the government of the day and replaced by what we now have is a national list, which is much more of a jewels in the crown, sort of the most significant places to the nation. So you can see that the nation frame has become more and more strongly embedded in that framework. And in a way, speaking against the Borough, or not against the Borough Charter, but critiquing the Borough Charter is almost seen as heresy in Australia, so it's can be a bit controversial, and I always like to be a little bit controversial, so that's good. But what spoke to me is this idea is that it's very hard for significance methodologies as we currently know them, to deal with emotional, magical, spiritual, made up qualities that actually reflect the way people feel and interact with material culture in their daily lives. And that even when a place or a thing might have those qualities, the significance assessment methodology tends to edit them away to come down with a defensible statement of significance that can be argued in court or within some other system. And so in thinking about what I've called in this paper the heritage of love, I was just being a little bit provocative about suggesting, can we think of a heritage of insignificance that has to do with these social worlds of quotidian pleasure, these things that mean something because they evoke a particular kind of sensuous or emotional response.
Yes.
I haven't read this book yet, but I'm reading a very similar book right now. It's called The Remnants of Separation, and it talks about the author. She's an Indian author, and she talks about the partition between India and Pakistan. And the book is about, she has interviewed a set of 15 people, and she talks about each of these 15 people, what were the last objects that they carried with them during the partition when they migrated from one country to another. And the book talks about these deeply personal objects that each of these families carried with them. And it's like a simple piece of cloth or a utensil or letter. And and now it is quite fascinating to me when I'm reading the book, where in the current scenario, because of the political upheaval between India and Pakistan, this book is actually giving a new voice to the almost an unbiased opinion of our history, because what we know of the partition was only through one perspective and not through personal life stories and people from the other side of the border and things like that. So, and another thing that the author also mentions, she says that these objects, these personal objects of every person, they mean something to them, and they're not only personal objects, but they spoke to the social community which were there. They were engaged with everyday life over there. And again, in this, it's another thing that's very fascinating to me when I'm reading this book now is that, again, right now, when we have political tensions between the two countries, this book is actually giving a new perspective to the ways in which we can imagine the future together. Because right now, these simple objects that she's talking about in the book make us realize what we shared as a heritage. So, like a shared history. So, for me, it's like a simple, for the families which are there, that time those objects were very simple things that they use every day. But the same objects right now, placed in today's context, they mean so much more. So the journey of an object, or where it was in the past and what it means in the future right now, and what it has potential, is spoken about in the book, and that is just one of the things that I know.
Oh, well, thank you so much for telling me about. Do you remember the author's name?
Achal Malhotra.
Oh, great. Oh, I'll make sure I read it. But I suppose what I would just respond briefly to your description is, I suppose I didn't spend too much time dwelling on this in talking about Pamuk's work, but how these emotional economies around these objects, how I suppose I focused on how they're felt in my talk. I also tried to make the point that they are all political and economic as well. And so a useful thinker in that space is Sarah Ahmed's, her work, Cultural Politics of Emotion, and her paper, Happy Objects, which provides some really important and interesting ways of thinking about how emotional objects in some ways can work to hide the histories that produced them, and how they can obscure those histories by some of the ways people think about them, and also I think she talks about affective contagion, how those objects can spread those feelings between people and in communities in important ways. So you might like to look at some of her work in thinking about that novel, which I'll look up myself.
I think like one of the most famous examples of how museums haven't built actually everyday objects to build their narratives is the Jewish Museum in Berlin. It's actually all the collection is based on objects that have been gathered by the Jewish community, and actually they renew their collection. And I think it's a very good example of how they actually don't use art or important objects, but everyday. And it's very, very hard to describe the collection that examples. It's very emotional.
Yes. Yeah. That
quoting numbers or giving facts, we go there and we see it's everyday objects. For me, when I visit it, it was very, very hard to gather that.
I don't know.
I think it's a very good example for someone who wants to see that actually how everyday objects can be very effective for telling very important story.
Yep. I don't know if you've read Edmund de Waal's Hair with the Amber Eyes, but you might enjoy it. It's about a very wealthy Jewish family's collection of high art and very precious objects. So it's not quotidian, it's not everyday objects. However, and it crafts this huge family saga around a small collection of objects that survived through the Holocaust and find their way back to a member of the family. And so it's a true story. It's Edmund de Waal's family story. And he's very conscious in writing. He's a very beautiful writer. He's an artist as well, actually. But he takes great pains to not descend into nostalgia or sort of golden era discourses. His family were one of those, the Efrusi family, who made a fortune from the trade in grain from around the Black Sea, and who lost this enormous fortune. And so he's very concerned with not focusing on the loss of that of these beautiful objects, but on focusing on the survival of the particular objects and how memories are captured by that survival and what they mean in the present. So it's an interesting example of a different way of looking at objects within that broader meta-narrative of the Holocaust.
Okay. On that note, Tracy, everyone, we'll draw a line because we're running close to the time when we have to be out of the building anyway. But thank you again so much for your presentation. Thank you all very much for coming and for the questions that you asked. And we're here again next week. I think it's Timmy.